thank you everyone for coming out today. And for those watching on the live stream, the board of directors of the Grayson-Jockey Club and the stewards of the Jockey Club thank everyone. This is our 11th event in addition to the welfare and safety of the Racehorse Summit. Since 2006, the Grayson-Jockey Club Research Foundation and the Jockey Club have underwritten and coordinated each summit. And our friends at Keeneland and our supporters at Keeneland have hosted every edition, except for the digital production in 2020. So with Keeneland undergoing a massive construction project this year, they had unfortunately had to pass on hosting. But we all look forward to seeing the new Keeneland. However, we are very appreciative that our friend Dean Cox and the University of Kentucky stepped up this year and provided this great space for us. Since our board of directors first suggested a summit that would be focused on the health and soundness of the thoroughbred racehorse in 2005, it's been rewarding to watch a culture of health and safety spread throughout the industry the last 2 decades. And in fact, now to further our culture of safety, we have the Horse Racing Safety and Integrity Act to act as a single entity to protect our animals with these great rules and ideas that are fostered at conferences like this. In addition to rule changes, the industry came together this past spring to launch a campaign through the NTRA entitled Safety Runs First. And that is run throughout a successful Triple Crown events and races. It's a great campaign we thought we should show you as well. Well, maybe. Shannon?
And hands-on care. Now the sport of thoroughbred racing is combining those timeless traditions with cutting-edge technology to raise our standards of equine safety to the highest level. Wearable biometric devices measure subtle changes in a horse's stride to help optimize safety and performance. State-of-the-art imaging technology helps pinpoint areas of potential concern for early intervention by expert veterinarians. And the sport's new independent regulator, the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, is using AI and enhanced data modeling to help prevent injury.
Quarter mile was a quick one.
From sunrise to sunset, there's an ecosystem of trust and care and a commitment to well-being. So win or lose, it's safety that runs first. To learn more, visit safetyrunsfirst.com.
As we said, it's been a culture change from 2006 in our first Welfare and Safety Summit, from veterinarian care to regulatory veterinarians to the future of wearable technology. The campaign now has been resulted in 190 million impressions, and we hope it continues throughout the year. It's very, very rewarding to see the industry highlight these areas that all of us are so concerned about. Today, you're going to hear a lot of the experts talk about these areas and highlight how the practices they're doing in their areas are keeping our athletes safe. Now I'll turn over our event to our Master of Ceremonies today, Anise Montplaisir, the Executive Director for Amplify Horse Racing. And again, I thank everyone for your attendance and your commitment to our horses.
Good morning. I'm Anise Montplaisir, Executive Director of the youth educational organization Amplify Horse Racing. My passion is introducing youth and young adults to the amazing opportunities in the thoroughbred industry. But my responsibility as an industry stakeholder is to continue educating myself so I can be an advocate for the horse and a positive representative of our sport. This is what brings all of us here today. The welfare and safety of the Racehorse Summit gathers a wide cross-section of the breeding, racing, and veterinary community with the shared goal of learning about progress and research for the advancement of safety and soundness of the thoroughbred racehorse. Today, we're going to learn about the work being done to create, maintain, and convey the culture of safety that has progressively grown in our sport through our veterinarians and horsemen, maintenance and care practices, how we analyze data, assessing horses for second disciplines, and how we clearly interpret and communicate all of that so that it is understandable to the general public. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker and introduce him. The Equine Injury Database was an original recommendation at the first Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit in 2006. After a 13-month pilot project, the database was launched in 2009. It collects data on horses that suffer a fatality as a direct result of injuries sustained within 72 hours of a race, and the data undergoes an extensive quality control process. 2023 marked the 15th year of volunteer industry reporting, and it included 99% of all thoroughbred starts. Of the flat racing starts at the racetracks participating in the database, 99.87% were completed without a fatality. Dr. Tim Parkin, head of Bristol Veterinary School at the University of Bristol, will update us on the risk factors associated with the fatality data and explain what the industry has learned from more than 7 million starts.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much to Grayson and the Jockey Club for inviting me back again. This is a regular visit for me, and I'm very pleased to have been involved with the EID since its inception in 2009, and the strength of what we are able to do just grows and grows. What I'm going to do today is really just update us on where we are. How do I get this to move? Is it working? Hold on. Can I go back? Thanks. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to update us on the current state of play, which you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure, but just to reaffirm, and then really just get into the meat of it, which is really just an update on a new fatal injury model that we've produced. It's actually still under construction now, but you guys are the first to hear the results from that model and really compare it to the model we produced back in 2016, which was used the first 5 years worth of data and see what's advanced since then. Talk about some of the risk factors and then really take us into the realm of what could come next, how we might actually take those risk factors and start talking about prediction, and therefore, if we're talking about prediction, the potential to prevent some of these injuries before they even get to the racetrack, and talk about what really is required to make that a reality. So the current state of play, having analysed the data for 2023, you can see the different surfaces here, overall, dirt, turf and synthetic. And really the numbers on the right-hand side simply indicate by how much they've all dropped since 2009 over the period. And you'll see, yes, there's been a bit of an uptick last year compared to where we were, but certainly if you look at synthetic, that was historically very, very low last year, and probably this is just now just trending back to the normal trend we might expect over the period. So I'm not overly concerned, but it's kind of interesting to see that actually the percentage drop amongst the three different surfaces is now sort of coalescing and becoming more and more similar. So if I just talk about, I said what I want to present mainly today is the new risk factor model for fatal injuries. Now this is fatal injuries that don't include sudden death. So I'm just going to talk about how the old model was produced first of all, and then make a comparison to the new. So the previous model included all EID fatalities, including sudden death. Published in 2019 using data from the 5 years 09 to 13, 1.9 million race starts, 3,500 fatal injuries. In that model, there was no race performance data, and limited, if any, workout data, very limited vet list data, and we included in that model 44 potential risk factors. I'm just going to move around so I can see the slides. In the new model, we now have taken out the sudden death cases. They were reported on in a paper 2013, specifically risk factors for sudden death. This now, we've been able to drill down into the reasons for fatal injury, and actually these are now essentially musculoskeletal fatal injuries. The study population now includes all horses born up from 31st December 2006. So Any fatalities that occur between 2006 and 2009 aren't included, but what it does enable us to do is have a full picture of the full racing history of every single horse that appears in the 2009 onwards EID. So you can imagine that some horses might have been 5 or 6 when they were fatally injured in 2009, but now we have their prior racing histories as well. So that's an advance on the previous model. We obviously only have reports from fully reporting tracks, but we've heard how many tracks are reporting. This is now 3.9 million, starts with 5,700 fatal injuries over the period. And where previously we sort of scratched the surface in terms of potential risk factors, looking at about 44 different potential risk factors, we now by routine, every time we receive the data from the Jockey Club around February, March time, we run the code that generates in excess of 300 potential risk factors that are fed into the model. Now, some of those risk factors are very, very similar to each other, but it's really important to look at the different forms of the same risk factor to try and understand which of those is best fitting the model. There's so much statistical power here that actually we're able to do that now quite efficiently. And really what it does, it means that actually now this new model has about in excess of 25 statistically significant risk factors in it, and there are approximately 9 new important risk factors that come out in this model in advance of the previous model. So what's not new? First of all, I thought it'd be interesting just to talk through actually what stayed consistent and what's not new. So reducing risk, year of racing is an interesting finding. So it follows the descriptive plot we've seen, and probably if we put year into the model, that would produce the best statistical fit, which is an important thing for us to consider. As epidemiologists, we're always trying to understand how the data best fits our model and actually produce the most valid model available to us. But obviously, year is very strongly associated with management changes, regulatory changes that have been put in place. So we can't include things like changes to void claim rule in the same model as year because they follow each other very strictly. So you can't, it's essentially trying to explain the same pieces of data using 2 different variables. So that doesn't work in models. One of them will be kicked out. It won't be statistically significant. So our view now is to exclude year of racing. That's just replicating what we all know in terms of the descriptive plot I've just shown you. What's more important is actually to include the variables that tell us why the year of changes, year would be statistically significant, why we've seen the drop. So we now include things like different regulatory changes. Void claim rule would be a good example in the models rather than years of racing. But in the previous model, year of racing was included in there, but you'll notice when we do publish this that it won't be included in the future model. So other things that haven't really changed, so shorter race distance still stays in the model. Primarily races under 6 furlong present a greater risk. Sex of the horse was in the previous model. It's slightly different here in that now gelding appears to be a slightly elevated risk to female horses, whereas previously it was entire males compared to everything else that were elevated risk. The risk for entire males hasn't changed that much. Age at first start still stays in the model. Again, younger is best. So if you can get races into 2-year-olds without overdoing it, then it's a good thing. It sort of enables them to have sort of lifelong protection to some degree. And genuinely, if you start as a 2-year-old, then actually for every start that you make, that a horse makes after that, they are at slightly reduced risk of ending up with a fatal injury. Shorter odds, so the favourite generally was very, very moderately increased risk. Previous success was also in previous models and stays in this model in slightly different forms, but the more places or wins is associated with a slightly reduced risk of fatal injury, which goes slightly contrary to the risk factor above, but nevertheless they both stay in the model. And there's some interesting interplay that must be going on between those 2 models, between those 2 risk factors. And finally, what's not new, surface and condition of the surface stay in the model as well. And you'll notice a few plots coming up here where they have this red box around it. The red box indicates where those levels are statistically different to the level of that variable on the far left. So this indicates, and just to explain this plot, this indicates that essentially if you're racing on dirt, you're about 1.55 times more likely to end up with a fatal injury than if you're racing on synthetic. So that's what this means, the odds of fatal injury. And you can see that if you're on off dirt, then the risk goes up slightly more. So in other words, anything that's not fast dirt, so affected by the weather primarily. And if you're racing on turf, then the odds is about 40% greater, 1.4 times greater than if you're racing on synthetic. So what has changed somewhat? There are some variables that have been modified a little bit, and I sort of tried to categorize these together. And this first set of variables relates to injuries, or previous injuries in models. And whereas previously in the previous model, we have number of previous injuries or number of previous scratches, now we have been able to analyze the triage data, which indicates whether those horses received a triage when they're on a racecourse. And triage can be 1, not very severe, up to 5, which is likely to be career-ending, maybe fatal injury. And what we see now is actually if horses have ever been triaged to any degree, whether that be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then they retain an elevated risk of fatal injury at all their subsequent races. And it is important to note that actually when you get some of those severe triage scores, 3 or 4, the likelihood of the horse going back to racing is quite low. So we're talking here about horses that primarily would be associated with a triage score 1 or 2. And the other thing that obviously has come in and been much more available to us in this new model is VETS list variables, and these are important. And you can see these are all related to, in some way, related to previous injury on the racetrack or indeed in training. And what we see with respect to vet list variables, whereas previously the model said if they've ever been on the vet list, then actually their risk stays elevated and never comes back down to baseline. We now have a slightly more subtle risk factor that appears here, which shows that actually the further you get away from having just come off having last been removed from the vet list, then your risk reduces slightly more and more and more. So you can see, you can see here that the risk is highest for those horses within 0 to 30 days having come off the vet list. It goes down a little bit. There's a bit of a dip here, but generally the trend is downwards here. But again, importantly to note, a horse that's been on the vet list will never return, in the model, will never return back to baseline what its risk was prior to being put on the vet list. Other things that have changed somewhat, so related to claiming races and change of trainer, different variables we produced here. So previously we had risk factor that described the intensity of training with the new trainer, having been claimed by an owner into a new yard, and the days with new trainer. So the longer they'd spent with the new trainer, then the risk reduced slightly for every day they were with that new trainer. Now in the models, we've got some rather complex relationships related to claiming race variables, which I'm not going to go into. There's lots of different variables that go in there. But then also now, actually, what the variable that produces the best fit for the model is the number of starts with the new trainer seems to be more important. And again, it shows the same pattern, but it's slightly more nuanced now. So, sorry, hold on, stop going forward. If a horse has never changed trainer, that's the reference. A horse is in the first 2 starts or 0 to 1 starts with the new trainer, then their risk is elevated by about 25%. If they're within 2 to 4 starts with the new trainer, their risk is elevated by 20%. And those are the 2 that are significant. But now what the model is telling us, once the horse gets to within 5+ races with the new trainer, actually they're not statistically significantly any greater risk than they were if they hadn't changed trainer. So we looked at it. It looks like those first 4 or 5 races with the new trainer, the high-risk races that really should that deserve some attention, and actually the new trainer should really pay attention to those particular horses. Not to say, obviously, the horses are totally out of the wood after that, but actually it suggests that actually that some real focus for the trainer in those first few races would be appropriate. So what is new? So new things that obviously come in that weren't available to us when we first ran the first model in any great degree are void claim rules, obviously, and these are kind of related to all of these variables as well. So there's a lot of interrelation here. And this is the best fit of the void claim rule. And actually, we've managed to, in the model, it's not just whether there's a void claiming rule in place at the track or not. It's actually the type of void claim rule is important. And I've listed the different types down here. And you can see that generally they go down in this direction here. So actually the most stringent void claim rules at a track reduce the risk by the most degree compared to not having a void claim rule at an individual track. Now, clearly, more and more tracks now have void claim rules, and prior, in the early years, there were very few tracks that did have void claim rules. But nevertheless, it does provide good evidence that actually introducing regulatory change, such as void claim rules, is a really important way of mitigating the risk for individual horses on individual tracks. Prior racing history is also somewhat new. So previously we did have variables relating to racing intensity and layup. Again, there are some variables in there that talk about that. It's rather complex. But really now what we've got in the model are kind of number of starts in different time periods prior to the current start. And that would be 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90, up to 180, 365 and plus. And generally, I've just produced this schematic here that gives you an indication what the models are telling us, what a good profile might be and what a bad profile might be if you're trying to understand risk in an individual race. And really, the good profiles are those here that are coming down the way. These are the bad profiles. So horses that have been racing quite a lot in the 90 to 180 days prior to the start we're talking about, and that now haven't been racing very much at all in the more recent period. Those are the horses that you might be more worried about. Horses that are on this sort of profile where they're relatively level or they've been racing moderately and actually maybe starting to pick up a little bit just in the previous 30 days or something like that. Those are the horses you might be less concerned about. That's just a general schematic of the type of results that we're seeing out of this. There's a bit of work to do here to finalize exactly what that's going to look like, but that's the kind of outcome that we're looking at. And then prior exercise history also comes into this. So this is now, again, stuff that was less available to us in the previous model, but we have much better recorded workout data now. And actually, days since last recorded workout seems to be important, with a longer period since the last workout period presenting a greater risk. And that kind of makes sense. That would suggest that there's something going on with the horses. Perhaps they're not ready to race, and actually there's something that's resulted in having a pause in their workout and their training, so they don't have a recorded workout. So those horses that were more than 29 days since their last workout were approaching twice as likely to end up with a fatal injury in the current race than those horses that had a workout within the 0 to 7 days prior to the race we're talking about. So that's skipping through the risk factors that we have identified so far. And to be honest, the model is still being run, and there are lots of new things, and we're trying to refine it to ensure that it hones in and it fits and is ready for publication. We'll be submitting it to a journal sometime over the summer. And really what I want to talk about now is actually where we could potentially take this, where this is going, where we're thinking about this in terms of risk prediction and therefore profiling. And there was a very good, useful meeting just 10 days ago in Toronto, Woodbine. IFHA pulled a load of experts together in fracture and sudden death. And really a lot of that focus of that discussion was around risk profiling and how we best use the available data we have. Whether that comes from epidemiological modeling or whether it comes from wearable tech or biomarkers, wherever it happens to be, actually how we coalesce all this information to produce a genuine risk profile for individual horses that might tell us something about the level of risk for individual horses. So I just want to talk a little bit about where we're going with respect to this. So a definition that I really just sort of plucked out, I sort of defined for myself what I understand to be risk profiling is using all of known risk factors. And now that would mean that there are going to be some risk factors we're unaware of or some risk factors we just don't measure. So there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty in these models. And it's estimating the likelihood that something bad, whatever that something bad will be, and we can produce risk profiles for lots of different outcomes, will happen to an individual. And then importantly, and I think this is the real sticking point, actually, and the difficult part, actually do something with that information. Make a decision, whoever it is going to be making a decision with that information. And there are lots of people who can make decisions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But how did we get here? So 25 years ago when I was doing my PhD, it was all about using paper records, subscribing to the Racing Post, and sort of manually entering data into an Excel spreadsheet, trying to get as many cases as we possibly could to identify risk factors. Thankfully, we've gone past that stage now. Data is plenty, and we can run risk factor models. They take a while to run and to nuance and make sure you get them correct, but we can run them relatively quickly, and with a bit of coding, they're not too difficult to run. But really the next step is actually to say, okay, when you've got that model, assess how accurate the model is at potentially predicting risk. And the important part about this is that the models we produce are developed on a set of data, but then the prediction has to happen on data that hasn't been used to produce that individual model. So in our situation, we might produce a model that goes from 2010 to 2020, for example, and then test it on data from 21, 22, 23, as if we'd had that model available to us, and say, okay, if we'd had the model available to us, how many individuals would the model have accurately predicted would have ended up and wouldn't have ended up with fatal injury? And really, that's the bit at the bottom here which says, okay, how discriminatory is the model? At the moment, the models we produced up until now have only been sort of about 65% discriminatory, 69, maybe 70%. So in other words, if you think about it, if you're trying to predict, you've got two horses going into a race, one which you know is going to end up with a fatal injury and one which isn't going to end up with fatal injury. If you toss a coin, you're going to get it right 50% of the time. At the moment, the models are about 70% of the time. So they're not that much of an improvement on tossing a coin, and it's certainly not good enough for regulatory intervention when you're dealing with a rare outcome. But it is important to indicate that actually I think we've made some significant advances over the last 6 months with different data, and I'm going to share that with you in a minute. So this first analysis gives us a hint as to some of the difficulties we identify and really lays bare how difficult it can be to use these data to predict outcome. And this is a specific outcome we did in a particular region, looking at the predictive risk of limb injury. So just to orientate you around this plot here. So the brown bars are the number of cases of limb injury, with the x-axis indicating the predicted risk of limb injury from the model. The blue line is the percentage of horses at each of those different points that sustained a limb injury. So the percent goes up this axis, and the number is up this axis. So you can see that the lower the risk of predicted injury, of limb injury, then obviously the greater the number of cases of limb injury there were. So what you see is this tail off here, but actually what you also see is some sort of plateauing here, where actually the model only gets as good at predicting about 30% of those horses at that level of risk would have ended up with injury. So if we put that into sort of numbers, we can produce a table that identifies the predicted risk at every level. Just picked out some numbers here. And you can see that essentially, if we said, okay, for the sake of it, let's say that anything that is by the model is predicted to have a risk that's above 10%, what would have happened in this situation is we would have ended up preventing 104 limb injuries, but we would have also prevented 475 horses from racing, which wouldn't have ended up with limb injury. So that produces a result of about 18% hit rate. So we're sort of 18% of those we prevent are actually genuine ones that we would have wanted to prevent. Now, if we went a little bit further and we sort of took a 30% predicted level of risk, then actually we're obviously identifying far fewer, 22, but we're also preventing far fewer horses from racing when actually they were fine. They were going to be fine anyway. And you can see that the hit rate then turns up to about 30%. So actually this is about as good as we've been able to get so far with some of the models we produced. But it does demonstrate that actually for every decision that we make, we're not going to get it right every time, and there is going to be consequence of some of the decisions that might be made if you were to use this purely on a regulatory basis, which I'm not suggesting we necessarily do. So I just want to talk a little bit about recent work that we've done with the Hong Kong Jockey Club, which has enabled us to use veterinary data in their modeling, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But before we go there, I just think it's important to think about the use of risk profiling. It's not just for regulation, i.e. deciding if a horse should race or not. There's plenty of use of these data that can be offered as advice to owners or trainers, ensuring that trainers genuinely understand the level of risk that their horse has. Every horse has a different profile, which will contribute to the risk that that individual horse has. And its risk profile will change as it goes through its racing career. So that might indicate to an owner or a trainer their risk appetite might be low or high, but they may make a decision, okay, the risk profile for this horse has reached the level where I'm going to decide I'm not going to risk it anymore. I'm going to retire the horse. I'm going to do something else with it. But equally, and I do think there is opportunity here, this could be used as an aid for deciding which horses might most benefit from advanced imaging. We've seen a lot of advanced imaging. It's very, very, very important, but we can't put every horse through advanced imaging every week, for example. And actually, if we can produce an algorithm that can identify which horses are most likely to benefit from that advanced imaging, then I think that's a real opportunity for us that would best use the resources we have available to us. And the other aspect, of course, is actually deciding which horses may most benefit from other resource intense, or to some extent resource intensive prediction tools such as wearable tech or biomarkers. Epidemiological modeling can be used across the whole cohort relatively easily. It doesn't require intervention from us, but it does enable us to identify which horses are most likely to benefit from further investigation. And really, it is all about, in an industry that is very resource intense, actually understanding how we best use our resources to identify those who are most likely to benefit. So this is a very busy slide. I don't want you really to look at the detail at all, but really this is just an indication of a model that my PhD student, Tom Zuffer, produced. He's just defended his PhD. These are the risk factors that were identified in a model produced for the Hong Kong Jockey Club. He uses a slightly different analytical technique where actually we don't exclude anything from the models. It's a Bayesian analysis, essentially. It means that everything contributes something, but it's possible to identify the contributors, the risk factors that are actually statistically associated with the outcome. And you can see here, there are 4 identified here. And these are, if you look here, if you can read this, these are related to veterinary interventions. So horses had phenylbutazone since his previous race, proportion of pass between race periods with an X-ray or an intra-articular corticosteroid injection, so how frequently they'd had a radiograph or an intra-articular corticosteroid injection. Horse had an X-ray and an intra-articular corticosteroid injection since his previous race. The proportion of pass between race periods with an intra-articular corticosteroid without a radiograph, and then horses had intra-articular corticosteroid injection without a radiograph since his previous race. Now, those last 2, those horses, that doesn't mean necessarily that the horses were receiving intra-articular corticosteroid injection without a diagnostic. It may be that they had a diagnostic radiography in the previous period between races. Then they decided it was going to treat them with maybe 2 sets of intra-articular corticosteroid injections. So it doesn't mean that they were necessarily receiving a non-diagnostic intra-articular corticosteroid injection. But you'll see that actually the value of getting that important veterinary information has really, really helped in these models, and really just to enhance that and just identify that in greater detail. The fit on the training data, whereas previously I'd said we could get a max to about 70%. In these models, we're now up to 85%. And that increase in a fit of the model is purely driven by the veterinary data. We have a lot of very good training data available to us, race training data available to us in this model as well, but relatively few of those actually contribute to any increased fit in the model. So the inclusion of veterinary data is really important. And there's a subtle message here about including horse as a random effect, but actually really important that actually we could try and achieve this by just including horse in some other way. But actually, if we want to know why, then actually getting the detail about that veterinary data is really, really critical. And really just to look at how much the predictability is improved by inclusion of the veterinary data. We've got 3 different models here: a baseline model where there's nothing included, a model without the vet and the training data, and then a model with the vet and training data. And the overall improvement in the predictability, there's a bit of a spurious, difficult scale to understand here. But if we assume that the maximum predictability is up here, we can see that 38% of the overall predictability in the model is provided simply by the veterinary training data on its own. And really what that means is that those few records or those few risk factors are disproportionately contributing to the predictability of the model. And really as a takeaway from this, what that means is the payback that you get from endeavoring to record and recruit and and analyze those data is far greater than probably the payback you get from any other type of variable we might think is worth identifying and starting to record now. So we did this we did this analysis with Hong Kong in the knowledge that they genuinely know what every horse does on every day of its life because they're a very controlled situation. But we really wanted to identify that our suspicion was true and finding was true, so that we can use this as a proof of concept to try and encourage other racing jurisdictions to start thinking about recording veterinary data. And I recognize it's very difficult and a very big ask to do, but actually I think this demonstrates that there is real value in attempting to do so. If we were to think about how in the future this might be used, and we're actually in discussion with the Hong Kong Jockey about piloting this with them over the next season. Tom Zuffer has said, my PhD student, I hope is going to be funded as a postdoc for the Hong Kong Jockey Club. But the development of the model is to go through the process that I've just described, identifying the risk factors. And really, when we do that, the big thing at the end there is the validation of the model on new data. So ensuring that it's doing what we hope it's going to do and actually what it's suggesting it is doing. If you get a big tick, that whole process can take anywhere sort of 3 to 6 months. If you get a big tick, then I think we're in the position, and I think we probably are now. As I said, we're starting to pilot this with Hong Kong. We're now in the position where you can start using that. And actually cranking the handle doesn't take long. So once you've got the algorithm set up, the system we're likely to have with Hong Kong is that they will, at race entry time, they will send us a list of maybe 140 horses overnight, and time zones help us here. Overnight, will be automatically, the handle will be cranked on the algorithm, and then by the next morning, they will have a list of risk profiles for individual horses. And you don't need to see the numbers in here. This is just a schematic. But essentially, what will happen is that those 140 horses will go back with a ranking of the horse with the risk profile that's highest risk and the horse with the risk profile with the lowest risk. And the way we hope that, and certainly having spoken to the regulatory vets in Hong Kong, and the way we hope they use this is essentially they won't use it to the only tool to determine whether a horse should race or not. They trot up every horse prior to race, they do pre-race checks. And if the vet is of an opinion that actually they're not quite sure about an individual horse, they might say, okay, what is the data? What is the risk profile for this horse also telling me? If the risk profile is also red, then they may make one decision. But if the risk profile, data-driven risk profile, is relatively low, they may actually make a different decision and let the horse race. So we see this just as an additional clinical aid for regulatory vets, and certainly we're going to be piloting this in Hong Kong. Just an important point about decision-making, and really just to understand that prediction is also risky. So it is really important that scientists like myself engage with racing jurisdictions and those and regulators who are going to be making the decisions and really make sure that we've covered all the bases, because this is a very, very simplified version of some of the decisions that could be made. But if someone's trying to look at a risk profile, you either allow it to race or you withdraw it. There are two outcomes. If you do allow it to race, then one is a good outcome, one is a very poor outcome. If you withdraw it, then it's not in that race. The next race, well, the very poor outcome, obviously the horse is not available for the next race. If the withdrawn horse might go on to win the next race, but actually the race for which it was withdrawn might have been its big classic race. It might have been the one race that actually would make a significant difference to his breeding career. So actually, it's really important to understand that actually all of this potentially ends up in litigation, and actually it's really critical that we get everything underwritten and sorted out before we launch any of these decision-making tools in this sort of purely regulatory way at the beginning. And we work very closely with racing jurisdictions to try and understand how to do that. Finally, I just want to sort of put this whole thing in context, really, where epidemiological risk profiling, this is, again, a bit of a busy slide, but it's important to understand that what we're trying to do here is actually use a series of different tests to hone in on individual populations of horses that are most likely to benefit from the outcome that we're looking to identify. So whether that be epidemiological risk profiling, the key is to try and remove horses that are truly negative, so definitely not at risk. And we can do this in different ways by using a series of tests with different properties related to their diagnostic test properties, sensitivity and specificity. But essentially what we're trying to do is say that we're in this situation here where we've got a large population, vast majority, 99% are negative, and you've got a tiny slice of individuals who are truly positive. The next test, what we're trying to do is remove some of these true negatives. The proportion of the population you take to the new test, that are truly positive, so genuinely at risk, gets bigger, same again, and then same again. So you're testing a smaller and smaller number, but you're definitively trying not to remove the true positives out of that population. So ultimately, it's a little bit of a boring maths thing, but actually, if you can artificially increase the prevalence of the outcome that you're trying to predict in the population that you're testing, ultimately, you're much more likely to be testing truly positive animals, and actually you're going to get a far smaller false positive rate, which is what we all want to try and avoid. So there's lots to be done in this area, looking at these different tests, understanding how we optimize each one. We can change the sensitivity and specificity of all of these tests by looking at different cut points, and there's lots to be done in this area to optimize this. And again, I think there is a real opportunity, whether it be with respect to allowing to race or not, actually identifying horses that are going to most benefit from advanced imaging, I think could be a real opportunity for us here. And just a final comment, again, to reiterate that it's not just about regulation and deciding whether something goes to advanced imaging and that sort of thing. There's a whole bunch of other actors here who can play a part and actually use some of the information that we have available to us to make evidence-based, data-driven decision-making, whether that be the trainer, the owner, the yard vet, the racetrack itself, or regulatory vets and others. I think there's an enormous opportunity with the data-rich environment in which we play and we work as scientists, actually to provide much greater level of information to the whole of the racing industry to help advance our cause. So just to summarize, as I said right back at the beginning, starts on all surfaces are now between 32 and 42% less risky than they were 15 years ago. Several risk factors are still relevant. The important thing here is it gives us confidence that they are real and potentially causally linked to the outcome that we're interested in. Several new risk factors, largely driven by newly available data, but also by more sophisticated ways of modeling, increasing the number of potential risk factors available to us. But importantly also, they provide evidence that actually there's been efficacious previous regulation put in place, and the void claim rule is a very good example of that. Risk profiling is definitely with us, and it certainly has the potential, and I hope I've identified the multiple different ways it can have that potential. But it does require the correct type and scope of data to be available. You can see with the available data we've got in Hong Kong how much more predictive those models could be and how we're going to start thinking about piloting risk profiling in that particular scenario. So I do encourage others to, and I recognize HISA is trying to do this in the States, and it's really, really critical that I think we all get behind that. And there are very many, just a final comment, there are very many ways to use this information, not just for regulation, and they're not for regulation in isolation either. I would never advocate using risk profiling models just to make a clear-cut yes-no decision about individual horses. So thank you for listening.